to start class of the day. We've gone through Leviticus. We're now in Numbers. And like you're in Numbers and you're like, this feels exactly the same. This is just as dry and boring. Don't worry, it gets more exciting. Numbers is a thrilling book. It just starts off slow. But to start class today, we're actually going to do a pop quiz. So I've made sure that you all have paper and that you all have a writing utensil. And then on your own, you are going to do this test. No cheating. It's closed book, closed notes. This should just be from your mind. And here are your 6 questions. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do this, all right? About 5 minutes. Good luck. You got to at least write something down.
I go to school all week just to compile.
I know. This was not on the syllabus.
Sally knows, I bet. Oh, I don't think so.
Who is? Ashley, what's the number 1?
Wow.
Chronological. Does it count if I just write what book of the Bible this is in? Yeah.
It's partial credit.
Okay, cool. Can we have you within 2 chapters? Like plus or minus 2 chapters? Can that be recorded? Okay.
Yes.
Somewhere in the Bible.
Yeah, really.
I'm pretty sure this is in the Apocrypha. The Book of Jubilee. Jesus is
Okay, thank you.
You have about 1 more minute. and time. Go ahead and put your name on the top, pass it to the front. I'm totally kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay. This is just an exercise because as we've been going through, I've been trying to emphasize some of these key chapters because there's a lot of information in the Bible, and each book of the Bible has a lot of things happening, and those things are happening sometimes out of chronological order. And what can happen is we grow up, some of us grow up in the church, and we could probably all tell stories about the majority of these people, but maybe it was hard to put them in order. And as we're reading through the Bible, we're reading and we're hearing about God's redemptive history of humanity from sin. So it's good to know how these things fit into the redemptive historical timeline because this is an unfolding story. Things that happen in Leviticus are different than things that happen in Isaiah and that things that happen in Acts. God is unfolding this redemptive plan. So it's helpful to be able to see that unfolding. And the way the story is unfolding, the backbone of the story is covenants. It's a story about God establishing a kingdom of which he's going to rule over through a human king. That's the idea in Genesis 1 with Adam, and that is culminated and fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So it's a story about kingdom. That's the thematic theme of the Bible is kingdoms, and it's through covenants. So covenants are the backbone. So we're just going to go through these. I'm going to ask for volunteers to answer who are confident on each one. So maybe know the one that you're really feeling good about. Number 1, chapter reference for the Noahic covenant. Genesis 8 or 9. If you put either of those, you'd be right. Yep. And if you were really feeling spicy, you could have put 6 through 9 because the word does show up a few times in there. But the covenant is made and established in 9, 8 and 9. That's when you have the stuff about the rainbow and the clouds and all that. And what is the Noahic covenant about? What's the agreement that God makes to humanity?
He will not do it again.
He won't cut off all flesh with a flood again. Yep. All right, chapter references. I always list 3 for the Abrahamic Covenant. Oh, close. Really close. 12, 15, and 17 of the book of Genesis. Good. Genesis 12, 15, 17. Yep. 12, you have the promise, the fivefold blessing, a blessing to the nations. 15 is when you have all that stuff about Abraham being reckoned as righteous when he's looking up at the stars and God passing through the cut apart animals. And then 17, you get the covenant sign, which is circumcision. All right, number 3, chapter reference for the Mosaic covenant, the covenant that is made with and through Moses. Exodus, not Exodus 2. This might be misleading that it's called a Mosaic covenant, but it's a covenant with the nation of Israel. No, I like it though. I like the boldness to try. Oh, so close. It is Exodus 19. Exodus 19. 19 is when they're at Mount Sinai. That's when God says, I will be your God. You will be my people if you obey the commands that I give you. So that's when they're establishing it. And remember, we looked at chapters 19 through 24. It's all this covenant ceremony, but the covenant is being made there in 19. This one, it's helpful if you know where the Mosaic covenant is. Chapter reference for the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20. It's the very next chapter. It's the start of the covenant vows of the ceremony. All right, chapter reference for the Day of Atonement.
Leviticus 16.
Yes, Leviticus 16. The center of Leviticus and the center of the Torah. All right. Now, is anyone highly confident to put these figures into chronological order? Some of them we haven't encountered yet. So that's why it's kind of a tough one.
That must mean that King Manasseh is not in the middle.
He is in the middle.
I'll tell you what John said.
Okay. Okay, does everybody agree that Adam is first?
Yes.
Love it.
Noah. Abraham.
Yeah.
Moses.
Ooh.
Judah.
Judah.
Wow.
Yeah, Judah. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, one named Judah.
Okay, so Judah, Moses.
Yep.
Josiah.
Ooh.
No.
All right, there's debates about these kings. Which king, Manasseh, David, or Josiah, comes first? Ooh. David. See, this one's tricky. This one's tricking you guys because Joseph has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But this is King Manasseh. So David, then which king?
Josiah.
King Manasseh,
Oh.
then Josiah. Yep.
Then Jesus, then Paul.
Yes. Great job.
Yeah.
David, King Manasseh, Josiah, then Jesus, then Paul. And we're going to encounter all those figures. So if you only got to like Abraham or maybe Judah or Moses, and you were feeling confident there and then you weren't confident, that's okay. We're going to encounter all of those people, so we're going to know what's going on. And those ones were only in my head because yesterday I was reading through 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles because stuff in Leviticus applies to 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings, so that's why I was in there thinking about it. All right, great job.
Extra credit if you put Jesus first.
Yes.
No, you don't. Here's why okay. You don't get extra credit for putting Jesus first. In fact, you would be wrong about that. If it said God the Son or the Son of God, referring to the second person of the Trinity, then yes, the second person of the Trinity is eternal, has always existed, was never created. But Jesus is referring to the person of the hypostatic union. That person, Jesus Christ, is fully God and fully man. So Jesus is someone who comes into being in the first century. He walked, lived, he died, and he rose from the grave. Although he was never created as God the Son. He is eternal. Yep. So Jesus has a historic moment of entering into the scene. That's why we would say that the Old Testament, a better way to talk about the Old Testament is that the Old Testament is about the Messiah rather than talking about saying it's about Jesus. Because the claim that Paul makes in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, he's appealing to Timothy to remember the scriptures that he's been taught, because the Old Testament is able to make him wise for salvation through faith in the Messiah. And then he names him Jesus. So the Old Testament is about the Messiah. Who the Messiah is Jesus of Nazareth, who lived 2,000 years ago, was crucified, and on the third day rose from the grave. So, do you get extra credit? No.
But she gets a cookie.
But you get a cookie. Okay, great job, everybody. I can see why teachers give pop quizzes. It's thrilling to watch people's faces drop and be sad. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. A lot of you weren't here last week, but that's okay. I'm not upset at you at all.
That's a dig.
Oh, what is going on? Ashley always likes to make fun of how I use this app because it can do a lot more than what I use it for. Okay, so this is what we talked about last week in really short form. We were in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is the center. What this is called is a chiasm, and this is used in poetry a lot, in Hebrew poetry, where you have A, B, C, B prime, A prime, where it's making a mountain or it's making a valley, and it draws your focus into the center. So we can see this on a really small scale when we're reading poetry, but then we see it on bigger scales when we're reading through books. It's used a lot. So even the Torah, which is 5 separate scrolls, the first 5 books of the Bible given to us by Moses, they are in themselves, they are in this macro structure. They're drawing our focus to the center. So Genesis and Deuteronomy have things that correlate to each other. One of which being that the beginning of the Abraham story, it starts in the land of Canaan, and then there's a progression away from Canaan, and then they find themselves in Egypt. Well, if we jump over to Deuteronomy, they're in the wilderness, but they're on the cusp of re-entering Canaan. So you have this frame of Canaan and Canaan. In Exodus and Numbers, the first half of Exodus is about all those plagues and about them leaving Egypt and coming to Mount Sinai. And then the second half of the book, when you get to chapter 19 all the way through 40, they are at Mount Sinai and they're getting all those plans for the tabernacle and for the priestly garments. And when we look at Numbers, what you've been reading, those first chapters, is all about the tabernacle and the priests and how to set up and how to tear down the tabernacle and how to march with the tabernacle. But then the second half, when we get to, I think our reading today, chapter 11, 10 or 11, is when they start to set out from Mount Sinai and they start going towards Canaan. So you have these mirroring each other, but then Leviticus also mirrors itself. So the beginning and the end, it's all these laws about the tabernacle and the sacrifices that you make at the tabernacle. Then you have chapters 8 through 11 and 21 through 22, which focus specifically on the priests and what the priests are supposed to be doing, the requirements for the priests. And then 11 through 15 were all of those laws about being clean and unclean and all the bodily fluid stuff. You're like, what is going on in this book? And then on the other hand, 17 through 20, those are also laws about what it looks like for the Israelite to live as holy. And we're going to look at some of those today. And it all centers on this narrative right in the center, which is Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, which also has this chiastic structure, bringing a focus to the center, where the focus is put on how atonement is going to be made for all sins. And the sins are going to be removed. So it's not just the center of the book of Leviticus, it's the center of the Torah, of what is the theological push and thrust of this story that we're hearing. Well, it's about a sacrifice being made for all sin and sin being removed. And that's an answer to a problem that we saw all the way back in Genesis 1 through 11, that humanity in their sin is removed from the presence of God. So how can sinful humanity be back in the presence of God? Well, the answer is atonement. And if you weren't here last week, what we did is then we compared this story about the Day of Atonement and these goats to a story that happened in Exodus where Moses wanted to be an atonement sacrifice for the people of Israel. God said no to Moses, but God's not going to say no to that, because eventually Jesus Christ is going to come. And just as John the Baptist says, here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Takes away the sins of the world. That's atonement language. So the story of Jesus and the gospel is a story about atonement, about how Christ died for all sins, to be covered and to be removed from sinful people so that people could be restored in a relationship to God. That's the gospel. That's what the Torah is about. It's all a foreshadow of that. So if that sounds intriguing, the recording for last week's class was in either Tuesday or Wednesday's email, I think. So you can just backtrack and find that. And you can watch it in a few chunks. So today we're going to zoom in on some of these things, and we're going to jump into the book of Numbers and point a few things out. So in your Bible, if you want to, go ahead and go to Leviticus chapter 18. Way back when we were in Genesis, one of the emails, I told you could read this for extra credit to figure out maybe what was going on with Noah and his son. Well, if you didn't read it, now you have read it, so it might inform you a little bit. Okay. Big picture, looking at this just really big picture real briefly, let's just utilize these headings. These headings are not in the Bible. These are added to the Bible. Same thing with chapter numbers and verse numbers. Those are artificially added by people later. So ESV, which is what I'm using, they've added these headings just to help me know what's going on. Maybe your Bible, if you have an NIV or a CSB, maybe it has a different heading. But that's okay. So just thinking about 18. All right, unlawful sexual relations. And we're going to scroll down. And then there's some weird stuff towards the end about the land vomiting out the inhabitants. And there's also stuff about offering children to Molech. We're just going to keep skimming through. We're actually going to talk about this. But then we get to chapter 19, and it's about how the Lord is holy. And then all these commands to love your neighbor, and they're almost echoing the 10 commandments of how to love your neighbor. And then again, reaffirmation to keep these statuses. And then we get to chapter 20, and we have a little section about punishment for child sacrifice. And oh, look, there's a mention of Molech again, sacrificing to Molech. That's interesting. And then, punishment for sexual immorality again. So then, you have these commands about sexual immorality. So 18 and 20, 18 starts with stuff about sexual immorality and then child sacrifice to Molech. 20, it starts with child sacrifice to Molech and then ends with sexual immorality. So you have sexual immorality, sexual immorality. Then you have sacrifice to Molech, sacrifice to Molech. So then chapter 19 is the center of those. It's being framed by these two ideas. So we have what's called a chiasm here, where our focus is being drawn into chapter 19. So if we then looked at chapter 19, we could move through it slowly and see, are there any repeated things in this, or is this all just one thing that's going on? But our focus is not on the don'ts. The focus is on the do's and the whys, because it's drawing our attention to chapter 19. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to skim read some and deep read other parts of chapter 18. And then we're going to go through some of chapter 19 and see what our focus is supposed to be being drawn to. And we're not going to do 20 because 20 is not the focus, 19 is. Does that make sense what I just showed? How it's mirroring? Okay. All right, chapter 18. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am Yahweh your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes." So that is the preface for everything we're about to read. God's going to give these purity laws to the people of Israel, and it's so that Israel does not act like the Egyptians, where they came from, and so that they do not act like the Canaanites to where they are going. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am Yahweh your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. So it is a means of life, of God-given life. This is a way to flourish for the people of Israel rather than descending into chaos like the surrounding nations. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am Yahweh. So this is going to be the phrase that's used all throughout this, uncover nakedness. And it's just it's a euphemism for sexual intercourse. We have euphemisms in our language too. Like we say, make love. That's a euphemism. This is the one that's being utilized here in Leviticus 18. Although there's other ones throughout the Old Testament, like things like, and he knew her. That's a euphemism for having sex. So this one's being chosen for a specific reason, uncovered nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. So pause for a moment. There is this dynamic where if you uncover one person's nakedness, it's also uncovering another person's nakedness. So there's an effect of shame that happens on someone else who is related to that individual. So it's not spelled out explicitly, but I just want you to think all the way back to Genesis 9, where Ham, he sees the nakedness of his father, Noah. He sees the nakedness. What a strange phrase to use in that story. What a strange phrase to use in Leviticus 18 when there are other euphemisms. Maybe it's connecting those stories, and what we're seeing as we're reading this is that might mean that Ham did something to Noah. It might also mean that he did something to one of Noah's other relational connections, maybe Noah's wife. So it's not spelled out very clearly for us, but there are these hints and these things that we can begin to put together. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, brought up in your father's family, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's relative. And it just keeps going on. Basically, don't sleep and marry people you're related to. And we would be like, well, of course, incest is super weird. Well, not back then. Not back then, and especially in Egypt and in Canaan. In Egypt and in Canaan, incest was a very popular thing. Even up to like 400 years ago, it was pretty popular, especially in royal families, to marry within the family to keep the family line a pure bloodline. So we're not too far removed from this idea of marrying within the family. And God is saying, do not marry and do not have sex with people that you are related to. So this is very countercultural because everyone in Egypt was doing it. It was very normal. And everyone in Canaan, where they're going, did it. It was very normal. So now Israel is going to be a countercultural people from where they came from and compared to the people that they're going to. Then we get, let's start in verse 19. So it seems like everything is about sexual relations and how you should not be with people you are related to. So it's spelling out, it's basically creating a hedge around what you can and cannot do when it comes to covenant marriage and sexual relations. Verse 19, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness, and you shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife and so make yourself unclean with her. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech and so profane the name of God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And you shall not lie with any animal and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall a woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. Okay. Lots going on, but just focus your attention into verse 21. Yeah, you have a question?
So in 19, why did your talking about the same thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is different phrases being used there. And then when you get to verse 22, when it's a male lying with a male as with a woman, instead of calling that uncovering nakedness, they call it an abomination. So there are these different phrases being used, and I do think there's a reason that they're doing it, but it's a longer discussion than a simple answer. Yeah. Okay, simple answer. I'll try. All the other ones are these dynamics of male with female and not breaking someone else's covenant relationship. So when you get to 20, you should not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife. Now you are breaking someone else's covenant. So I think that's why a different phrase is being used there. And then 22, it's not a male-female relationship, it's a male-male relationship. So then again, that's why a different word is used. And when we get to the book of Ezekiel, this word for abomination in the singular is also used in Ezekiel when talking about what's taking place in Sodom and Gomorrah, which was a male-on-male distinction. So I think there's just the uncovered nakedness is being used to convey a male-female distinction, not necessarily one that's breaking someone else's covenant. And then in 20, you have lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, not using a euphemism because you're breaking someone else's covenant. And then in 22, again, another word conveyed because it's a male-male dynamic. So it's just words to distinguish those things.
John,
Yeah.
Since we had, Noah and, Nakedness.
Yeah.
And Abraham married Sarah's half-sister.
Uh-huh.
So is this, were those precursors to the Leviticus, dictate in terms of what you should not do? Because they were already been done?
I think I'm following your question. Was Abraham in the wrong for marrying Sarai, his half sister? Is that what you're asking?
Well, yeah. So he did. I mean, that's
Yeah.
a fact.
Yep.
And then the fact that they did see Noah and his nakedness.
Yep.
So
Or is it just?
moving forward, is that, these new precepts based on, these are things that took place that we don't want to see happen again?
Okay, yes, I'm tracking with it. So, yeah, it's like, were those things okay because this law hadn't come yet? Or are those things still bad? Well, I think as the Torah is a whole unit given to us by Moses, what happens is this is all meditation literature where we reread it and reread it. And the first reading, if you first encountered Abraham, you're like, his sister, like that's interesting. And you don't really know what to think about it. And then you get to hear and you backtrack and you're like, oh, that was bad. And yet God is working with and through those corrupt humans, and he's calling them out of darkness and calling them into a new life and light to live in. So yeah, I think you read back and you say something bad was happening there, and yet God is redeeming this people and using someone so broken as Abraham to bring about Jesus Christ. So good question. So this whole chapter seems to be about sexual relations, and then we get to verse 21, which seems to be just like out of nowhere. What is going on? You shall not give any of your children to offer them, or give your children to pass through the fire to Molech, and so profane the name of God. I am Yahweh. And then it goes back to the talk about sexuality. So I get to something like this, and I'm like, why is this here? It seems so disconnected from everything else that I was reading. And usually when I come to the Bible and I think, there's something wrong with this, usually the answer is there's something wrong with how I'm reading it, and I'm not understanding what this is presenting very well. So I've wrestled with this chapter for a while, and so think about what's going on here. All this talk about sexual relations, it's giving you then a picture that you get to in chapter 19 about what covenant faithfulness looks like. Covenant faithfulness between a man and a woman, not related to each other, brought together and bound together into a covenant that is before God and is not meant to be broken by anything except for death. So covenant fidelity between a man and a woman in marriage, what does that mirror? That mirrors and reflects God's covenant relationship with his people. We know that in Ephesians chapter 5. We know that from Hosea in the Old Testament. This is a prominent metaphor for how God relates to his people, because God relates to his people in a covenant. And what does it look like to be covenantally unfaithful in marriage? Well, to sleep with someone else, or to go outside of the design for marriage. What about between us and God? Well, it looks like to worship someone other than Yahweh through means that he has not given us. And the epitome of covenant infidelity when it comes to our relationship with God is to worship in a way that he does not designate us to, and to worship someone other than him. This is a little verse about being unfaithful as a covenant member to God, and worshiping Molech, which is he's a Canaanite deity, but also kind of Babylonian, pretty common deity in the ancient world. But one of the ways they worshipped Molech is they would sacrifice children by burning them alive. Pretty big no-no. It profanes the name of God. You should not do it. But it's just inserted all of a sudden into this chapter. And I think this chapter is not primarily about your sexual ethics. It's primarily about your covenant fidelity. What does it mean to be faithful in a covenant? And this is spelling it out. And when we get to a verse like this, even though it's one verse out of 30 in this chapter, this one verse is actually helping us see the meaning of all these other verses. That your sexual purity and ethic is not just about you and relating to other people, it's about you relating to God. That is why our sexual ethic is so important, because it's one of the ways that we relate to and worship God. Yes, Daniel.
I noticed that Molech verse
Mm-hmm.
middle relatively,
Mm-hmm.
over the back, mentioned something about a chiastic literary structure.
Mm-hmm.
A few weeks ago, is this chapter written chiastic?
So you came in just a little bit late. Chapters 18 through 20 are chiastic. So 18 starts off with these sexual ethics, and towards the end, you're hearing about false worship of Molech. Then chapter 19 is about being holy as God is holy. Then chapter 20 starts off with worship to Molech, false worship to Molech, and then sexual ethics. So the center is be holy as your God is holy. So our focus, everything is drawing us towards being holy as God is holy. But wait, there's still more cool things in here that I want to think about. Start in verse 24. Sorry, that was my baby crying. Do not make yourself unclean by any of these things. For by all these, the nations I am driving out before you, you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I will punish its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. So why the sojourner having to be included in this? Because it doesn't just pollute the people, it pollutes the land they're going into. And the land is important. Just like the tabernacle has to be cleansed by the Day of Atonement, so also the land needs to be cleansed and then remain cleansed. Verse 27, for the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean. Lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the person who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourself unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Okay, what interesting word was in that paragraph? Vomit. What a strange word to use. If you get online, you could do like Blue Letter Bible or Bible Hub, and you can do a word search, even from the original language. This word vomit means to vomit. And most of the time it's used in the Bible, it does just mean to vomit. Like in Jeremiah, he talks about the kings getting drunk and then vomiting. Like they get so sick that they throw up their lunch that they had that day. But then here it's being used as a metaphor, and it shows up here, and then I think off the top of my head in chapter 20 again, and it's being used as a metaphor, a very strange and obscure metaphor for the land vomiting out the inhabitants. And God is telling the Israelites, make sure that you keep my statutes and don't break them, otherwise the land will vomit you out. The land will kick you out. And if you don't know the big storyline of the Bible, so we have this nation of Israel. They're going to go into the promised land, and they're going to become a kingdom. But then that kingdom is going to become divided, and then that kingdom is going to fall, and the people are going to be taken away in exile. They're going to be removed from the land. They're going to be vomited out. Well, why are they going to be vomited out? If we go to 2 Kings chapter 21, King Manasseh. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Ooh, he was doing what the nations were doing. For he rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal and made Asherah, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem will I put my name. And he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord, and he burned his son as an offering, and used fortune-telling and omens, and dealt with mediums and with necromancy. Manasseh burned his sons alive. He let them pass through the fire. Now, it doesn't say Molech, but what is this an echo back to? It's Leviticus chapter 18. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. And the carved image of Asherah that he had made, he set in the house of which the Lord said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave to their fathers, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. So because of this is why the Babylonian exile happens. And Manasseh is about 100 years before Babylonian exile. But this is why exile happens. I did not write a reference down, but if we jump towards the end, 26. Oh, maybe 25. There is more mention of Manasseh. Oh, actually, I think I searched it. Okay, in 2 Kings 24:3. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, that's another word for Babylonians, and the bands of the Syrians, and the bands of the Moabites, and the bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah, that's referring to the kingdom of Judah, to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants, the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. So when we're thinking, why did Babylonian exile happen? Well, the people of Israel were descending into further and further sin. But the straw that broke the camel's back was Manasseh sacrificing his son. And it says that the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. The Lord would not pardon. So it's implied here and then also in 2 Chronicles that it wasn't just Manasseh doing this, but because he was king, he led everybody into these acts of worship on the high places, on these hills, and people were burning their children alive. A horrible act, and that is why Babylonian exile happens. Now, another way we could think about it is, what were the social and political reasons that Babylonian exile happened? And that's a great thing to think about because there are these two sides of the coin. There's the social political reasons, and we'll see that, like Hezekiah back around 700 BC, so about 150 years before Babylonian exile, he invited the Babylonians in. He showed them all the storehouses of their gold and silver. He said, look at how rich we are. And the Babylonians were like, oh, yeah, you guys are really rich. So it's like that was a poor political move. But the theological reason it happens, the reason God sends the people of Israel into exile is because Manasseh led the people to sacrifice their children through fire. Yes.
How does Genesis Abraham?
You're introduced to that story right at the beginning that it's a test. And then in Hebrews chapter 11, God had promised Abraham that through Isaac, all the blessing would come to the nations. So even though Abraham doesn't understand, according to Hebrews, Abraham believes that God would raise him even from the dead if he has to kill him. So it's a test, and also God's going to be faithful to his promises and not break them. And Isaac hasn't had a child yet.
I get that it's a test,
Yeah.
but it still seems like God isn't entirely against burnt offerings of your children. It's just when it's not to him.
He's totally against it. And you'll hear multiple times throughout that he's against it. Yeah. Yeah, I think we have to trust the biblical testimony that it is a test and that God would never have Abraham sacrifice his son. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would. Good thought, Daniel. Okay. So there's and we just started in Leviticus 18, and then all of a sudden we're in 2 Kings thinking about the Babylonian exile. But Leviticus is really important for the biblical storyline. So jumping back to Leviticus 18, we end that. One more thing about the vomiting out. So Babylonian exile, same with Assyrian exile, is a vomiting out of the land. Can you think of any stories in the Bible that have to do with vomit? Huh? Jonah. Jonah is a story that has to do with vomit. One of the few mentions of this word vomit. And it's this prophet of the nation of Israel who is vomited out of the land. He actually leaves the land, swallowed by a fish, and he's vomited out on foreign land, and then he goes into Nineveh, which is Assyria. Jonah becomes a picture of a Syrian exile. And one of the things, don't have time to read it, but one of the things that the Assyrians did, and the Assyrian kings, when they took people into exile, one of their cruel ways of doing it was putting giant fish hooks through their cheeks. Boom, pop it through the cheek and then lead them off into exile. So then you have this story about Jonah being swallowed by a fish and then vomited onto the land and being brought into Nineveh. Come on. So when we get there, that's going to be a fun book to read because it's so much more than just Jonah. It's a picture of Israel. Okay, so then we get to chapter 19. Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Holy means set apart. God is unique in all ways. There's none like him. And because God is like that, his people who are in a covenant should also be like this. And this command is reaffirmed in the New Testament for us in 1 Peter and in other places. Because God is holy, we also should be holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metals. I am the Lord your God. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, or on the day after, and anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with the fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted. It will not be accepted. And everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. And then it keeps going. But the idea is that you are going to be holy as your God is holy. And the way you do that is by observing the covenants given. Here are the things to do. Rather than, it's not just a list of don'ts, it's also a list of do's. Here's how to live as a holy people. And then we have commands that deal specifically about how we interact with people. And we'll read this section because it culminates in a pretty popular verse. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your fields right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleaning after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave for them the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So this is the idea of leaving the perimeter so that a sojourner can come and have some food to eat. I wonder if there's going to be any stories in our Bible that is going to emphasize this practice right here. It's the book of Ruth. And it's in the day of the Judges when it seems like people weren't doing this. They already weren't obeying this, but Boaz was a man of high character. He was a mighty man of valor. And because he was of high character, he left stuff to be gleaned. And that's when Ruth gets introduced, who's a Moabite. And it's through Boaz and Ruth that we get David. And from David, we get Jesus. All because someone was faithful to the Levitical commands. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah. So Leviticus keeps talking about like sojourner. Is there some kind of historical context that like would they be referring to a specific ethnic group, or is it just kind of like anyone?
Anyone, yeah, and it means like someone who travels. It's the Hebrew word gar. So to say the sojourner is Hagar. Remember Hagar, the Egyptian who's in the land of Canaan and then how they mistreat her. They mistreat the sojourner. And the reason why there's so much emphasis is because God will say throughout, as we're reading, that you were sojourners in the land of Egypt and you were slaves, and you know how much that sucked. So take care of, he doesn't use that word, right? So take care of people in your land. Be better than what you had. Yeah. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You're like, oh yeah, this is great. This is great stuff for being human. You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. I'm watching Seinfeld right now with Chelsea. Like she's never watched it. I don't know if you have like feelings about Seinfeld, but there's this one episode that we just watched last night where Elaine works with this guy who has a hearing aid, and she thinks that he's faking it and like trying to get out of work by pretending to be deaf. So there's this one scene where she's standing behind him, she's like saying all this stuff to him, but he can't hear it. And then her boss overhears it, and he buys them tickets to go to this show because he heard her saying things that like she liked him to this guy. And he says, well, I know you wouldn't have just been playing with his disability because that would be so cruel and offensive. But it's just like this, like, why would you, like, if you're cursing someone who's deaf, that's like doubly cruel because they can't even hear the cursings that you're cursing on them. And then a stumbling block in front of a blind person, like someone blind is walking around, you're like, this will be funny, guys, and you trip them, like you're a messed up human, right? So don't do those things. Instead, you shall fear your God, I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defend or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. So in other words, you're going to give a true and right verdict. You're not going to change your testimony just because you pity someone in their poverty. And in the same way, you're not going to change your testimony to benefit someone who has power and status so that you might get an upper hand by having a good relationship with them. You're going to be honest regardless of who it is, and you're not going to show partiality. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. When Jesus is asked, what is the greatest command? He answers with two scriptures. He says the greatest command and then one like it. First, he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he quotes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And his quote here, this verse, is not just like a standalone, oh, I don't really know what that looks like. Well, you've been reading like chapters about what that looks like. 18 and 19 and 20 is about what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. You actually get a lot of detail about what that would look like. Be honest. Bring benefit to those in need. Help others. Don't be a false witness. Don't curse people who can't even hear you. Be a decent human being. Like all of these are pictures of what it looks like to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Okay, so that's right there. That's the center of these three chapters. So 18, 19, 20, it's all focusing on love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is what it means to be holy as your God is holy. So what does it mean that I am whole? I should be holy as my God is holy? Well, it means that I should love my neighbor as I love myself. And that's why Paul can say things like in Romans that if you love your neighbor, you fulfill the law, because you're being holy as your God is holy. And that is the summation of the law. Okay. What time is it? Oh my gosh. Okay, real quick, Leviticus 25. We're not going to read it, but we're going to talk about it. Leviticus 25 is another one of those chapters that, like, if you have room to keep track of all of them, so you have Genesis 9, Genesis 12, 15, 17, you have Exodus 19, Exodus 20, you have Leviticus 16. Well, Leviticus 25, you should probably just like sprinkle in there if you have room in your noggin, because the year of Jubilee, the Sabbath year, the Sabbath of Sabbaths is an important biblical theme. So the idea of Sabbath is the cycle of 7. So every 7 days, the people of Israel are supposed to stop and rest, which is Saturday. They stop, they don't work, they don't gather. Instead, they intentionally inconvenience themselves and remind themselves that God is King and Lord over their life, and he is the one who provides. Well, not just every 7 days, but then cycles of 7. So every 49 days, on the 50th day, there are these celebrations that happen. But then in cycles of years too, so the land is supposed to get a Sabbath rest. Every 7 years, they're supposed to let the fields rest and not work. Well, when we get to Chronicles, one of the things at the ends of Chronicles is that the expulsion that happens, it's to provide the land with the rest that the Israelites never gave them. So the total of The time that they're out of the land is 70 years. So there were 70 cycles of 7 that the people of Israel did not give the land to rest. And that's one of the reasons that they're exiled, is so the land can have rest. Well, then every 7 cycles of 7 years is what's called the Year of Jubilee. And the Year of Jubilee is the year when all things are restored. So it's the 50th year. You go 7 cycles of 7, 49, and then the next year is a Jubilee year. And everything is restored. If you purchase land from someone, well, the land goes back to the original owner. If you had sold yourself into debt slavery, well, when the Year of Jubilee comes, you are set free no matter what. If someone has incurred debt, if someone has incurred property from someone else, if someone is currently a slave, the Year of Jubilee sets the record straight and everything gets restored back to square one, ground zero. But it's a year that celebrates the liberation from captivity for people who are slaves. The Year of Jubilee is very important. So important that it's the pinnacle of Jesus' ministry. In Luke chapter 4, this is how Jesus starts his ministry. He came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. And he unrolled the scroll, and he found the place where it was written. So he specifically looks for a certain place. He doesn't just read aimlessly. He looked for the place where he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering the sight of the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Well, this is a quote from Isaiah 61. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint heart, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined city, the devastations of many generations." So this hope in Isaiah is that a suffering servant was going to come. He was going to restore people back to God, and he was going to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which is the release of captives, the release of bondage, the release from slavery. And that is a promise from Leviticus 25, specifically 10. "You shall consecrate the 5th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, which when each of you shall return to his property and each of you shall return to his clan." So proclaiming liberty is about being released from some sort of slavery, some sort of debt, and that's what Jesus is proclaiming. He is proclaiming the ultimate year of Jubilee throughout his ministry. He is proclaiming freedom from bondage, the bondage to sin and death, sickness and oppression. That is what Jesus' ministry is about, which is all a callback to Leviticus 25. Like, how important is Leviticus to our understanding of the New Testament? We can understand Jesus' ministry without this, but it just gives color that Jesus is bringing people back to a restored state and redeeming them from slavery. Yeah.
Would that also be why in modern culture, to vote, they have to return to their, in Israel, they have to return to their home?
I don't know. It's a good
Do you
question.
think it could be related? Or is that just?
I would have to think. You're thinking about the beginning of the gospel.
Hmm?
You're thinking about yeah. I would have to think about that more because there does seem to be a lot of historic evidence that says that was kind of weird that they were doing that during the time of Jesus. Yeah. So I don't know why. Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah. I'll think about it. No, that's great. Yeah, Daniel.
And plus that was
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Michael.
So, I just promised land or like
Mhm. Yeah, I see. So this Leviticus 25 is supposed to happen while they're in the promised land. Every 50 years, this is supposed to happen. It would seem like every 50 years, this never happened. Like they never do this. That's part of the reason why they're exiled. When they're in exile, the hope is that there would be a better Jubilee, not just one within the land, but a Jubilee from the nations. So that's what Isaiah 61 is about, not just in the promised land, but in the entire world, that people would be liberated from captivity because they're all prisoners in a foreign land. So then when Jesus comes on the scene, even though the Israelites are in the quote unquote promised land, they're under foreign occupation. They are prisoners and they're captives in their own land. And he goes around, he's proclaiming this liberty of the captives. And then some of them, they're all like, okay, so are you going to restore the kingdom back to Israel? And he's like, you don't quite get what I'm doing. Because Jesus is thinking about something even greater than being set free from slavery from a nation. He's thinking about being set free from slavery of sin and death. Yeah. So this is why at the very beginning, I had you put some names into chronological order. This is the unfolding of redemptive history. That things in Leviticus look different than the things in Isaiah, which look different than things in Jesus' time. So there's a redemptive unfolding of God's historic redemptive plan. I think I saw one more hand. No. Okay. Let's jump to the book of Numbers and think about Numbers for a little bit. So Numbers also has a good literary structure, although I don't think it's as helpful to draw it or to talk about it as far as reading. But there's these progressions of locations. So at the beginning, they're at Mount Sinai. Then they'll set off from Mount Sinai, and there's 3 chapters where they're traveling. And then they're in the wilderness of Paran. Then they'll be there for a while. Then there's going to be a few more chapters where they're wandering. And then they're in the wilderness of Moab. So they're changing locations. So they're in Sinai, then they're in Paran, then they're in Moab with these traveling narratives in between. There's also all this complaining going on in the book of Numbers. It's like the people just complain and complain and complain. And there's actually 7 very specific stories about complaining and judgment that comes on the people. And on a really big scale, when we're thinking, why do we have the book of Numbers? And what's the important significance of Numbers? Numbers is going to show you why this generation of Israel does not go into the promised land. So 40 years they wander in the wilderness. 40 years is a very long time. I have not even been alive for 40 years. I haven't even been alive for 30 years. 40 years in the wilderness. So if all of us young bucks, let's just say we were all the people who left the land of Egypt. Well, us young bucks, we start having kids and stuff. All of us, we die in the wilderness, but our children go into the promised land. The book of Numbers is showing you why we all die, because we complain and grumble against God over and over again. Everyone, including Moses. Moses does not go into the promised land. He dies outside the promised land because of one of the stories that we'll read in Numbers. Moses disqualifies himself. I had lunch a few weeks ago with a childhood friend. He's not a Christian. He would have considered himself a really hard atheist for a long time. Now he doesn't really know if he's an atheist. But he last year tried to read through the Bible, and he got to the book of Numbers, and he was like disgusted by it. He's like, these people are so horrible, and I can't believe God is approving of all these things. And he brought up some examples from the book of Numbers, and I said, well, let's talk about those. And we read some of them in context, and I was like, well, as we're reading, nowhere is God approving of what they're doing right here. And he's like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. He's like, still, but these are horrible, horrible things. And I said, I think God agrees with you, because none of these people enter the promised land because of what they're doing in these stories. So he was actually having like a visceral reaction to how they were behaving. And I think it was the right reaction. So as we read these stories, we, in one hand, should be disgusted with how they behave, but also we should be humbled because they're a mirror for our own sinful nature. So we're going to talk about those 7 stories, those 7 tests and grumbling stories that happen. We're going to talk about that next week. But I just want to point out a few things in the beginning of Numbers. So Numbers chapter 1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the 2nd month in the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. So just thinking about the time. It is the first day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year after the land of Egypt. Numbers chapter 9, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the 1st month of the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. I'm just pointing out that chapter 9 chronologically happens before chapter 1. Chapter 9 happens before chapter 1 as far as the historic chronology. But the primary concern of the book of Numbers is not the historic chronology. So for some reason, there is a thematic ordering of why they would put Passover instructions after everything that we got in chapters 1 through 8. That's all I'm going to say on it. I just think that's cool and interesting that there's a month difference. So because then I read that and I started going back and I was like, well, what was the contents of chapters 1 through 8? And I start thinking about it and trying to read back through and see what's going on. But in chapters 1 through 8, it's not just about the sanctuary and the tearing down and how to arrange the camp where the tabernacle is in the center and you have 3 tribes on both sides that all camp. So like physically and theologically, God is the center of the nation of Israel and should be the center of their living and their going. But it's also about the Levites. It's in the book of Numbers that the Levites become established as priests. Nowhere, I searched this last night at 5 a.m. when Chelsea was feeding Noah because I couldn't sleep. Nowhere in the book of Leviticus are Levites mentioned. They're only called priests. You get the mention of Aaron, who's a Levite, Aaron as the high priest. But besides that, it just refers to the priests as priests, not as Levites. So it's almost misleading that we call the book Leviticus, Leviticus. But we call it that because the ancient translators who translated it into Greek, they were like, oh, these are all the commands that are given to the people of Levi. Well, they're the commands that are given to the priests, and the priests become the Levites. And that happens in the book of Numbers. So Numbers chapter 3 and 4, you have the description of the duties of the Levites. And this is an echo or callback to what happened in chapter 32 or 33 of Exodus. And in Exodus 32, I think it is, when the people worship the golden calf, and then Moses comes down, he breaks the tablets, and he says, if anyone is for the Lord, let him join me. And the Levites come. And then the Levites become this army that slay the people who were leading the charge of this rebellion. 3,000 die. And Moses says, today you've been consecrated and set apart for the service of the Lord. Well, now we're learning, what does that service of the Lord look like? Well, it looks like polishing menorahs and setting up poles in the tabernacle. So the duties of the Levites are described. And then you get the redemption of the firstborn. And this is a helpful case study to understand, what does redemption mean? Since Jesus redeems us, we have redemption through Christ. What does redemption mean? Well, this is a little picture of it. The Lord said to Moses, list all the firstborn males of the people of Israel from a month old and upward, taking the number of their names. And you shall take the Levites for me. I am the Lord. Instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel, which was the original plan back in Exodus 12, after God kills the firstborn of Egypt, he also claims all the firstborn of Israel as his own for his service. But now the Levites are going to replace that. Instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel and the cattle of the Levites, instead of all the firstborn among the cattle of the people of Israel. So Moses listed all the firstborn among the people of Israel as the Lord commanded him. And all the firstborn males, according to the number of names from a month old and upward, as listed, were 22,273. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel, and the cattle of the Levites instead of their cattle. The Levites shall be mine, I am the Lord. And as a redemption price for the 273 of the firstborn of the people of Israel, over and above the number of the male Levites, you shall take 5 shekels per head. You shall take them according to the shekel of the sanctuary, the shekel of 20 gerahs, and give the money to Aaron and his sons as the redemption price for those who are over. So Moses took the redemption money for those who were over and above those redeemed by the Levites. From the firstborn of the people of Israel, he took the money, 1,365 shekels by the shekel of the sanctuary, and Moses gave the redemption money to Aaron and his sons according to the word of the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. So this is all about redemption. So what from this does redemption mean? Okay, so you have Israelites. We're going to keep it simple with just 5. Israelite firstborns. They are supposed to belong to the Lord, but now Levites are going to redeem them. For every Levite firstborn replaces one of the Israelite firstborns. So the Levites are becoming a substitute. But if there's not enough Levites for the firstborns of Israel, then there can be a redemption with money. And all of them go to the sanctuary. They're set apart for the service of the Lord. Even the finances are set apart for the service of the Lord in the sanctuary. So redemption is about a payment being made in the place of someone else. A payment being made in the place of someone else. There's a lot more to it, but it's at least that, a payment being made in the place of someone else. Ephesians 1. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, with which he has blessed us in the beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight, making known to us this mystery. So redemption, it's the purchasing of someone, the financial purchasing of someone in someone's place on behalf of them. That is what Christ is doing for us. And you have a little picture of that back in the book of Numbers with the Levites, that a purchase is made in place of someone else. Well, Christ made a purchase in our place with his blood. And that's why in 1 Peter, he talks about the blood of Christ as being more precious than gold and silver, because that is the price that God pays to purchase us for the service of his sanctuary, which is the church in the New Testament. Back to Numbers. Numbers chapter 6. So you have all these details about the Levitical priests being set apart for the service of the Lord. Then you have the Nazirite vow, which is essentially anyone saying, I'm going to set myself apart for the service of the Lord for a certain time being. And they might not serve in the tabernacle, but they are set apart for the service of the Lord. So it's a willing offering of themselves, and they abstain from touching dead things, from drinking, and from cutting their hair. There are going to be 2 Nazirites from birth in the Bible, Samuel and what's his name? Samson, strong Samson, and then Delilah. And then right after this, after all the consecration of everyone, you have the Aaronic Blessing. And this is a really famous Bible section. And when it comes to biblical studies about ancient texts, This is one of the earliest texts that we actually have a record of, and it's written on a silver scroll. It's called the Silver Scroll if you Google it, and it dates back to, I think, 700 BC, and it's this blessing written on a thin piece of silver, but it's the Aaronic Blessing. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance or his face upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. So the role of the priest and then the high priest is to pronounce blessing over the nation of Israel. And they pronounce this blessing, and after the people are blessed, I just want to point out this order. After the people are blessed, then you get chapter 7, which is the 12 tribes offering 12 sacrifices. So the blessing precedes the sacrifice. Blessing, then offering. Then you have this mention of the menorah in chapter 8, the 7 lamps. And it's just like, why this detail right here? It seems almost out of place. But you have the blessing of the people. Then the people make offering. And the menorah is inside of the tabernacle. And there multiple times it's mentioned that the lamp is supposed to shine in front of the lampstand. He set up its lamps in front of the lampstand as the Lord commanded. When you set up the lamps, the 7 lamps shall give light in front of the lampstand. So there keeps being this emphasis on in front of the lampstand. So in the tabernacle, I have a drawing of this. We did this last week. In tabernacle, you have within the holy place, you have the menorah on the north side, and then on the other side, you have the table of showbread. And there's 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's always supposed to be bread, 12 loaves for the 12 tribes, showing that God provides food, provides life continuously for the nation of Israel. And there's all this emphasis on the menorah shining light in front of itself, which would be onto the bread. And the light is symbolic for the instruction and Torah of God. So God shines his light on the life of the people of Israel. So also God shines his light in the Torah for what gives life to the people of Israel. And in Leviticus 18, verse 4, verse 5, in them you will live by them, referring to the instructions. So right here you have basically like this microcosm and this theater playing out where these represent God's words to us that shine light on what gives life perpetually to the people. Then you have the cleansing of the Levites and then the story of Passover. And how are the Levites cleansed? With water. And then Passover meal is celebrated. So there's water, then Passover. Through water, then Passover. Kind of like going through the water and then having the covenant meal 1 year ago for the people of Israel. Okay, we're going to stop there. I think today you read Numbers 11, or maybe that's tomorrow. No, that's today. So Numbers 11 starts these stories of complaints. These stories of complaints, there's going to be 7 big ones, and there's going to be judgment that comes upon the people, and the judgment ultimately will be to not enter the promised land. But there is also glimmers of hope in them. So in Numbers 11, I'd encourage you to look at the hope of the Spirit of God, the hope for the Spirit of God. And we're going to save the last bit of our time just for questions. You guys have been reading a lot. You've been covering a lot. We've talked about a lot. Open to questions. Sally?
Okay. When Jacob was wrestling with God
Mm-hmm.
in the Bible,
Yeah.
bone, but it talks about in Levi, that it's tied with an animal. Leviticus 7:1. In Numbers, it talks about it. And 32:25.
731? Of-
7:31.
And what are you calling my attention to?
The
with Jacob, it's the hip socket, and then it's the sinew that's mentioned. They don't eat the sinew.
So they talk about that's the socket. Rest and numbers, all that is the thigh itself, not the thigh bone.
Right.
So there's different.
Yeah. It's the hip joint with the story of Jacob. And there's a little, like, almost like a footnote by the author. It says, this is why the people don't eat the sinew of the hip socket. Yeah. So good question. So there's a distinction between the bone and the sinew.
So when they do the thigh, it's kind of separated also on their offering, right?
I'd have to think about it more. We should talk about it a little bit more. I'll have to look at the numbers section that you're talking about. Yeah.
I'm wondering about dates, calendar dates.
Oh, yeah.
How do we align that with our current calendar?
Yeah, great question. So dates. If you've noticed, when you get to Exodus 25 through Numbers 10, there's going to be all these references for dates up by months. Outside of those, it's just by years that there's references. Dates by years. Months are according to the Levitical system. So the closer we get to the Tabernacle, Leviticus, the more we have stuff by numbers. So the calendars are really confusing because they actually have two calendars. But what we've been reading so far has been the ceremonial calendar, which the first month, the month of Aviv, is marked by Passover. That is the first month, and we can always remember when Passover is because every year when we celebrate Easter, that is Passover weekend. So April is the start of their ceremonial calendar year. They also have another calendar that has Rosh Hashanah. Anyone hear of that holiday? It means the head of the year or the new year. But so Rosh Hashanah happens, I think, very beginning of September. So they have two calendars, and they have 14 months in their calendar. So April could be the start of the month, in which case the 7th month when they do the Day of Atonement is towards the end of September when they celebrate that. But then their other calendar with Rosh Hashanah starts with basically our September is when that calendar starts. And it starts with the Festival of the Trumpets, and then the Booths, Festival of Booths, and then the Festival of Day of Atonement. Like that's all the first month. And it's all a celebration. Like the entire first month of that calendar is celebration. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go back to the flood narrative and think about the flood narrative because there's so much mention about months. Why does that narrative mention months? And how do they even have a calendar then that accords to the Israelite calendar? And which calendar are they using? I think about that one at nighttime a lot too. Question.
So in Numbers 2, there's the arrangement of the tribal camps,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's the tabernacle in the center, and you have 3 to the east, 3 to the west,
Yep.
3 to the north, 3 to the south.
Yes.
How does that play into your whole idea of is exile and west is holy, especially because I think Judah is the most.
Yes. I was thinking about that too. It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. East is also where the sun rises. So it's also like the place of new birth and life. So there's that whole play going on. It's also a place of like to guard. So if you think about the tabernacle, where the cherubim are, it's an east doorway, an east facing doorway. So you have Judah as like the eastmost guard, guarding the encampment. But then Judah also leads the camp. So when they're walking, they're the first one. So I wonder if they were heading in an eastward direction. But yeah, that's a really good question. I've been thinking about that too. Yeah, Morgan.
Here we go again.
Here we go.
This one. Numbers 6, 9. I'm just so confused with. Okay, so it takes a Nazarite and somebody just drops dead in front of them.
Yep.
And then they are doing all of these things in front of God as if they sin. I don't understand why they have to take this period away from everybody and shave their head because they were in the presence of a dead body when didn't even know they were gonna die.
Mm.
I just don't get it.
So they're not acting as though they've sinned. They're acting as though they are unclean. And there is a distinction. Eventually, those ideas get merged together in key texts like Leviticus 16, that there's this correlation. But being unclean has an association with touching things of death. Whether that be bodily fluids or other things, it's having an association with death. And death is a result of sin, and it's opposed to God. God is life. These other things are death. So there just requires a cleansing period. Sometimes it's just, hey, wait until nighttime, because that's when the new day starts. So it's not as though they've necessarily sinned. It's just that they're in a state of uncleanness and need
So is that
purification.
the same? Because it says as a guilt offering.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just? I don't know. Like, are they? Is it the same thing? Like.
Yeah, so after reading Leviticus 18, the idea of cleanness and sinfulness do get merged and connected to each other. So when we do hamartiology, which is the study of sin, there are a lot of ways we commit sin. You remember Leviticus 4, unintentional sin? We commit sin unintentionally. There's intentional sin. There's the sin of omission, which is not doing the right thing. There's the sin of commission, which is doing the wrong thing. Then there's social sin, that by being connected to you, when you sin, I sin inadvertently through your sinful actions. So sin is a very complex topic. We try to simplify it, but it's really complex. And we begin to see that here, where there's a connection between uncleanness and sin. And part of and our uncleanness is basically like a living parable to our actual spiritual state, which is sinful. Yeah. Good question, Morgan. We have time for like one more question. Yeah.
What's the whole deal with the test for an unfaithful wife?
Oh.
Feels like you know,
Super
Monty
weird.
Python, like if she floats.
Oh yeah, if she floats, she's a witch, but if she sinks, then she wasn't. Yes, that is very funny. Good reference. It does feel like Monty Python, doesn't it? It's not Monty Python though, which is reassuring. This was a means for the Israelites to see if a wife was unfaithful. So what happens is they take some holy water and some holy dust from the floor of the sanctuary, mix it together, and trusting that this is God's way to be faithful to give judgment. So a husband comes, he's super jealous. He says, I think my wife is cheating on me. I just have no proof whatsoever. So the priest says, well, we're not just going to stone her just because you think that. We're going to trust the Lord and to reveal what is true. So this happens with the dirt water, mud water. You can buy mud water now. Did you know that? Like, people are selling mud water. They're like, it's really good for your system. It's like, get out of here. But holy mud water? Come on. So she drinks it. And the test that happens is if she is guilty, her thigh falls away from her and her stomach bloats. Thigh being a reference to the female organs. So what would happen is it's kind of unclear, but either she would become incapable of having a child or would grow in a bloat. That's basically the test. And if that doesn't happen, then she did not commit adultery. She is innocent. You do not punish her whatsoever. The guy was just jealous. Mike, you have a question about this?
Not that.
Oh, okay. Does that help, or are you still confused?
I mean, why can't it go the other way? Like, why can't a wife be like, hey, I think cheating?
Well, I think it can, because when you get laws about adultery, you stone both of them, not just one of them. Both of the people who are involved in the adultery get stoned. So I think it can go both ways. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
When she drinks the dirty water,
Holy dirty water.
that like asking or to show, you know, if she, or is there really some way that the dirty water shows her?
It's just,
innocence?
yeah, I don't know. It's God's prescribed way of revealing what is true in the tabernacle. Yeah, and I think it's an act of faith on both, of all three parties, really. So the the one who is jealous, rather than taking matters into his own hands, he takes it before the Lord. The priest, rather than trying to play judge, because the Israelites do have judges, rather than playing judge, he trusts this method that God gave them specifically. And then the wife, she actually does present herself, and she takes these certain oaths and cues, which she does not have to, because there are laws about oaths and how you are doing that out of your own will. So she takes these oaths upon herself. So it's like these three parties, an act of faith that God will reveal what is true and be faithful, and there's not a way to hide. But if you are clean and you are innocent, then that's what will be shown. But if you are trying to lie both to your spouse or to your priest or to God himself, it'll be revealed. I don't know why God gave this method, but it's pretty interesting, and it's not Monty Python, even though it would make a good Monty Python scene. Yeah. All right.
So the new covenant eliminates a lot of the Old Testament
Yep.
rules.
Yeah.
How do we determine which ones are and which ones are not?
That's a great question that I will not be able to answer in under a minute. But in Hebrews, you do have a mention that as the priesthood changes, so does the law that we are under. We are under a new covenant law. We are under the law of the Spirit. I think the law that we're under now is more intense than the law the Levites were under. Because Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I say to you that if you are angry with your brother, you are liable to the same judgment. And if you insult your brother, you are liable to the same hellfire. So I think we're under a more strict law, but that question about which ones apply, which ones do not, is a good question that people have been wrestling with for 2,000 years, because there are laws for the Jewish people about what to do in the sanctuary, and there's no temple anymore for them. So how do they apply the Day of Atonement? Well, one rabbi around the time of Jesus, he says the way we do the Day of Atonement now is through good works and care for the poor. So it's a great question. We should think about that. Maybe when we finish the Torah, we'll have that discussion. But let me pray for us, and then let's go worship together. Father, thank you for this morning, and thank you for showing us so much from your word about what it means to be redeemed, to be purchased out of sin, and to be set free from captivity. And God, also what it means to be faithful to you. God, we want to be holy as you are holy, and we want to be faithful in our covenant towards you as you are always faithful towards us, even when we are unfaithful. And God, one of the ways that we can be faithful is by being faithful to each other and loving each other as we love ourselves. So God, empower us to do that this morning and this week, and be with us in our days. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, y'all. Great time. Book of Numbers, 7 tests, 7 complaints, 7 judgments. It's going to be great. Lots of water and quail and snakes and the land swallowing people up and bread. Sally, you want to ask me more about that question?
You want me to say